start it now. So here we go. Okay, thank you. So yeah, just give us an
Okay.
intro, Dr. Nolan.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm a professor in the Department of Pathology at Stanford in the medical school. And I have a laboratory of about 30 or so people, mostly graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, many of whom who are residents or clinical individuals in training. They already have their MD, or postdocs already have their PhD, and so they're doing more advanced training. And most of what we work on in my laboratory is cancer and immunology research. We look at tissues and use various kinds of mathematical approaches to understand why one immune system cell is next to a cancer, next to another kind of immune system cell, et cetera. It's pretty advanced stuff, both mathematically and then also technically. We develop instruments and we spin out companies, create companies, sell them. I probably sold about $1 billion worth of companies over my career. I'm 62, just for some understanding. That's Cleo. She's my CIA minder back there.
I like it. Nice. Hi, Cleo.
So I'm just a scientist, at heart. That's everything I've done. And then it was actually probably about almost now a little over 10 years ago that I got involved with this. And that was primarily because of the work that I was doing at the time in my lab. And I'm basically, some people from the CIA and an aerospace company showed up in my office one day at Stanford unannounced. I got a knock on the door, and they said, we need to speak to Professor Nolan about something. And I said, that's me. And then they showed me their credentials, and I kind of was surprised. Why is the CIA at my office? And they said, look, we need your help on something very important. And I said, we need you not to talk about this, at least now. Later, I was allowed to talk about it. And so then they showed me, they didn't mention anything about UFOs or anything at the beginning. And then they asked me to look at some medical files that they had brought with them, mostly MRI images. MRI images are kind of like X-rays in a way. If you don't know what an MRI is, it's a magnetic resonance imaging. And it's a way of looking inside of the body, deep inside of the body, without using X-rays, which can be dangerous. And you can basically get a 3D image of structures inside of your body. And so they were showing me mostly pictures of individuals' brains that, if you know anything about an MRI, looked damaged, right? You could clearly see all kinds of scarring inside of the brains. And I happen to know how to look at these things, at least at one level, because my sister has multiple sclerosis. And so you can see these damaged white patches in the brain that are kind of randomly distributed throughout the brain. And depending upon where the damage is, that can cause different problems for the individual who has MS. And so, then I said, okay, well, fine, I get it. I see they had about probably 10 or so MRIs. I said, you've got some, obviously, people who are damaged. What happened to them? I said, well, some of them reported that they'd gotten close to these strange floating, glowing craft, or they had different stories for each individual. And, we've done pretty much full medical workups on these individuals. And now we need you. We asked around, and they said, who has the best analysis system for blood, so we can do a deep dive on their blood to see what kind of signatures might be in the blood. And everybody said that you're the best at it. You have developed the most advanced instrumentation for doing this. And so would you be willing to help us? And I've told this story on everything from Tucker Carlson to, more than a couple of dozen national news programs and things. I said, well, sure, I guess. But I thought it was a joke, honestly, at the beginning. Then I did what I could with them. I can't talk about any of the results because there's like medical ethics rules talking about those things. Primarily because I can't talk about the individuals, primarily because, you know, some of these individuals have come out, and if I say anything about one of them, somebody will assume I'm talking about the other. Mm-hmm. So, but because I had done my job at the time with the people that they had brought me, and they said, okay, well, we have some, you know, there's some more stuff to look at, more stuff to help with. And, you know, fast forward to today, because we got 10 years to go over and we don't have 10 years to talk about it. I then got involved with the people who had released the videos of the craft. These are the pilots who had seen these anomalous craft around the U.S. Air Force carriers, both on the East and the West Coast. It wasn't just one time, there were multiple times, and it's actually still going on. Multiple events, literally going on like last week as well, for many days at a time, not just one off. And so I got involved with the pilots. I got involved with some of the military personnel on the inside who had decided that the upper branches in the command structure were trying to ignore this. That's a question we can ask at a different, you know, later on. Why has people been trying to ignore this for so long? What's there to hide? And so then some of these individuals got together with the New York Times and a woman by the name of Leslie Keene, a reporter from the New York Times, and another guy, Ralph Blumenthal, a reporter from the New York Times, and they wrote front page newspaper article, basically releasing the videos. And I don't know, have you shown them, Laurel, the videos?
They had an assignment and hopefully looked at them as part of their assignment at home last week. So yeah.
Well, so the videos, the public ones, showed things moving around or near the airplanes that were doing things that we can't, doing impossible movements, going from 0 to 5,000 miles an hour in a second, stopping while going at 5,000 miles at a second. I mean, you know what happens if you stop at a stop sign too fast, you nearly go through the window. If you hit something, even at 70, 80 miles an hour, you'll literally go through the window and end up on the road in a smeary mess. And so at 5,000 miles an hour, you'd basically be putting at, you know, and there'd be nothing, very little left of your car. So how are they doing that? What are these things? Are they radar glitches? Are they just pilots who are imagining things? So, you know, first thing you got to say about the pilots is these are individuals who are, you know, if you know a fighter jet pilot, these are steely-eyed men and women, and one of them was a woman and the other was a man. Steely-eyed people. They're trained for a decade. Many millions of dollars goes into their training. They're flying around in, you know, in pieces of equipment that cost about $500 million or so each, right? These are not toys. So we entrust them with a lot of responsibility, and so, you know, these individuals basically told their story, and they actually also told their story on 60 Minutes about 2 years ago as well.
Yeah, we watched that for class.
And that was kind of a moment when everything changed. You know, the videos came out, people were like, oh, okay, it's videos. You know, videos can be faked, blah, blah, blah. Well, they weren't faked, but, you know, videos can be faked. But when the pilots came out and then told their story on national television, there's something about that, you know, one-to-one connection that humans make with each other that basically told much of the population that there was something going on here. This coincided with me being asked to talk more publicly then about the damage that had been done to some of these individuals. And it culminated about actually 2 years ago with Congress starting to get involved. where Congress had congressional hearings where they literally brought in some of the leaders in the Department of Defense and they grilled them. And actually, the Department of Defense leaders were made to look like idiots, which is often the case, to be unfortunately truthful, because they don't really know what's going on. They're just sort of put up as figureheads. And then because they didn't get good answers from these individuals, laws were written both last year and this year. And this year, the law was just rewritten, establishing an office, believe it or not, for the study of UFOs research. It's called the Arrow Office, but it's largely for the study of unidentified aerial phenomena. And the mandate is that now all of the defense forces, all of our satellites and sensor systems that previously had been aimed at looking for incoming missiles from China or Russia or North Korea have now been recalibrated to additionally look for things that previously they were throwing away. And all that data on at least I think twice yearly basis goes to this office for writing up a report to Congress. Now, what was important was the new language in the bill has some other things in it, like going all the way back to the original Roswell and Trinity event. Actually, there was a supposed crash before before Roswell, and that was the Trinity event. Also, that was very near the first nuclear bomb blast, which has some interesting correlations to when did we first really start paying attention to these things, or when did they seem to show up. And so the law says we want you to go back and we want you to tell us every time you tried to fool the public with a lie about what it was that people saw. We want to know about all the crash retrieval programs, and there have been, again, allegedly, I'm not personally knowledgeable of it, but I know the people who say that they're knowledgeable of it. There are, for instance, fast response teams that are set up that should anything happen, anything seems to come down, very quickly these response teams are sent out to retrieve the craft or material, and in some cases, biological living things, and bring them back to the United States and put them away in somewhere. And so Congress said, again, enough is enough. We want to know about this. You don't have to, we're not saying that this will all be put out on the internet tomorrow, but we want the reports to know what's real and what's true. So why would Congress get involved? Well, first of all, the way that it was pitched to Congress, and I was part of the behind the scenes efforts to get the pitching done right, was to say, well, look, it's not just what people have seen. We have multiple witnesses. These are now pilots, et cetera, simultaneously seeing these things. We have corroborating radar and other signal tracing. So it's not just like some drunk, truck driver on the highway at 2 o'clock in the morning who, basically mistook a street light for a UFO. We have all of these simultaneous sightings, which basically makes what the pilots are saying truthful. And they're doing these things that people say that they're doing. So, okay, what might it be? Well, they can rule out natural phenomena, because we've never seen natural phenomenon like this. We actually do have pictures of actual technological objects, craft. And the Congress has actually seen these in private and secret classified briefings. And one of the Congress people came out and said this, Congressman Burchett came out and said, look, I've seen the pictures. This is not garbage. There's something here. So they've said, we want to know about all the efforts that you've made to confuse the public, because actually people's lives have been ruined because of it, right? I mean, if you've seen something and you're in the military or you're a commercial pilot and you come out and you say it, it could for many years ruin your career. Now it can't. In fact, you might have seen some of the stuff in the newspapers about the commercial pilots who now are coming forward and saying things. the last month, there've been a lot of reports of that. And then this is something that I was involved with in getting the language in, which was to say it's time to bring scientists in, academic scientists, get them clearances, so that we can see the secret data, and then we have to sign pieces of paper that say we won't say what it was that we saw, and help us start to figure out what this is. So, but what we had said to Congress was, and this is what got both the Republicans and the Democrats on the same side for this, for probably the first time in about 10 years, in terms of a bipartisanship, was, well, look, we don't know what it is, but what happens if it's the Russians? Or what happens if it's the Chinese? And we're seeing dozens of these things around our aircraft carriers or our nuclear facilities. And that's where they are showing up around our nuclear power plants and things. We're being surveilled by the Russians and the Chinese, and they have craft that can do things that we're not. So that's a danger, right? They can basically willingly step in and out of our airspace, even our controlled airspace, and ignore the rules. And, so if we don't know what they're doing and they're doing something we don't know how to do, then we might be in trouble. So if they ever decided to declare war on us, they could run rings around us. So that scared the bejesus, literally, out of the Senate and the Congress. And they said, okay, well, we're gonna force the DoD to bring all of this to the open. But so what I was involved with was basically, as I said, getting all these people to understand that they needed to bring scientists in, because it's not that scientists know more than anybody else. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's just that there's a way, an approach of thinking, of methodically going through data and understanding it, that scientists are just good at. I mean, like, I wouldn't put me out on a battlefield to make decisions, and neither would I put a soldier in my lab to run an experiment. Your average scientist doesn't go in the battlefield. Your average soldier doesn't go in a laboratory. There's a method for each of those arenas. So where we are now is the Defense Department budget literally is about to be signed by Biden. I think they're in the final stages of the Congress and Senate getting together and organizing what they're going to do with the $835 billion, it's an extraordinary number, defense budget. And some of that money is going towards this more public office. Now, as it turns out, for probably the last 3 or 4 decades, a lot of money has been going in, apparently, to the reverse engineering of some of the so-called craft. And this is all alleged. I'm alleging this, because it's kind of an open secret, but nobody will ever say that it actually happened. So, so where we are today is in a process of what the lay public would like to think of as disclosure. This basically admission by our government that there's something here. But one of the, but I've been involved in a couple of side pushes. And that is, well, why do we need daddy government to tell us the data, right? So, the data is there for all to see. There's plenty of people who have seen this stuff. Science thinks of those or calls them anecdotes. But there's a professor at Harvard. He was the former chair of the astrophysics department at Harvard, a guy by the name of Avi Loeb. He's not the chair anymore, but he stepped aside. I think they have what's called a rotating chair system there, where they each hand it over to other people along, every few years. And Avi said, okay, well, for a number of other reasons, he was interested in this. It's a longer story. Maybe you should have Avi in at some point. He said, well, look, the skies are not classified. There's nothing to stop us from collecting our own data and start to basically see whether or not there's anything here. And so he's in the process, and a wealthy patron has stepped in and given him a bunch of money to build all kinds of telescope systems I'm actually involved in that project. It's called the Galileo Project. Avi's a friend now. I didn't know of him before. And so now you have two serious, credentialed, respected, whatever you want to say. We both have named chairs, scientists saying, okay, look, we don't know what it is, but it's something, and no matter what it is, it can be made subject to the scientific method. And part of that scientific method and what part of my role has been is teaching the lay public how to talk about it. That one of the problems that a lot of the lay public have made is they come to these conclusions about what's being seen. It's Martians, it's reptilians from the Andromeda galaxy or whatever. Things that might be true, but if they can be disproven, make the person uttering the claim look silly. So my point has been, and I've gotten a lot of people now to take it this way, is convince people about the data, that the data is true. Here's the numbers. Here's what we're seeing happening. Okay, and if I can convince you that it's true, that the data is real, it's no longer, from a scientific viewpoint, my responsibility to explain it. I can now say, if you don't agree with what I think it might be, you tell me what it is. You don't get to shoot down every idea that I have if you're not willing to step up to the plate and give your own answers. And that's kind of how science works. So by taking the conclusions out of the public discourse, you then get to say, well, look, the data is real. We're seeing this stuff. I don't know what it is, but it's something. So is it the Chinese? Well, our intelligence capabilities and what we know the Chinese can do, it's not. Is it the Russians? Well, we see how the Russians are getting stomped over in the Ukraine. So we know that it's not them, because if they had that sort of stuff, they would have won the Ukrainian war already. So, well, what does it leave? I mean, nobody's saying it because everybody is holding fast to I'm not going to make a conclusion until I know what it is. So what Congress knows now is, though, that, and this is alleged, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. But from the inside, the people who I know say, it's not from here. Now, whether they've been here for a long time, whether they just recently arrived, we don't know. I mean, if I were to guess, I would say that they've probably been here longer than we've been civilized. So what it does is it opens up a whole series of questions. And this is sort of, it gets to this point of, well, why wouldn't they let us know? What are they scared of letting us know? Well, if they are real, it tells us that we're not at the top of the food chain, right? Humanity's self-respect comes from thinking it's at the top of the animal kingdom food chain. I don't mean like eating each other. I just mean, we're the boss brain. Well, apparently we're not the boss brain. Somebody else has been here. Okay, well, fine. Okay, so who cares? If they don't show up and they're not on my front lawn, why should I care? Well, think about what it means to many religions, right? There's how many religions on this planet? 1,000, 2,000? And there's 3 major religions, 4, let's say, right? There's, I'm not a religious scholar, so Christianity, Muslims, Judaism, Zen, Buddhism, a few others, and then various kinds of tribal religions. All of them have a different idea of who is the supreme being, or is there a supreme being? Okay, well, if there is a supreme being and a God, what do the aliens believe in? Right. And is there a cry? So many things start to come to the fore for discussion, that at least so there's been public policy papers written back in the 50s and the 60s about this stuff, saying we can't let the public know because people will be rioting in the street. Right. And they'll be tearing their hair out, and we won't know who we are. And so there's that. But what the military was, we know, afraid of is, well, what you're telling us is that you can't protect us from this, right? That you don't have the ability to protect us from what these things are doing. And so why are we giving you so much money if you can't even protect us from them? I mean, the open question is, it's not clear that we need to be protected from them, because it's not necessarily clear that they're even interested in us that much. Right. I mean, I would use this example. If you're an advanced species or advanced intelligence, why do you care what the ants are doing? So other things that have been raised are we basically a nature preserve? Like we preserve places in the Amazon or in Africa for the wild things to live. Is Earth a nature preserve? Right? Do they need our resources? Unlikely. Because they probably can make or need anything they want. So, so those are the kinds of things that when you have people who say that they are the boss and they are in control, like the military, et cetera, and then really they're afraid to let you know that they aren't in control, then that's a problem. So I wrote for some of the intelligence committees a white paper, basically going over a lot of these things as a think piece to say, look, here are the things you need to consider. Here's what's going on. I mean, and giving them, basically, I wrote a term paper for Congress, saying what it is that what my thoughts are. And so, I mean, for me, it's kind of been a journey of kind of being dragged out of my day job, like in a movie, to help on a subject matter that, once I got into it, is so fascinating. I every day I get up and I look out the window, or I take my dogs for a walk, and when I look at the sky, I don't see the sky anymore. I see, I see the potential for so many other things. I don't think about world politics as a world. I think of it as much more of a microcosm of a larger reality, saying, okay, well, these things don't seem to want to hide themselves too much. They want us to know that they're there, but they're not going to land on the White House lawn, or they haven't. And they seem to have limited contact with humanity. So what's their agenda? So I'm involved with setting up an organization, as are many other people, different organizations, to start to normalize this whole discussion, to make it possible for scientists to talk about it without being laughed at. I mean, people might laugh at me, but on this, out of the other side of their mouth, they say, well, look, we have to respect what you've done in your life, Garry. You've changed clinical practice, with gene therapy. You've made all of these instruments and things that you've done. You've published over 350 papers, et cetera, et cetera. You've changed how immunology is done. So you can't be that crazy. I mean, maybe I am, but it's exciting because now, because of not just me, but what Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon and a number of others who are on the inside have managed to do, is we've opened the conversation up and made it serious. So yesterday, for instance, I flew down to Orange County to do an interview with one of the pilots, Ryan Graves, who had been one of the people who had seen these things in the very first instances. And he's running a podcast, which is associated with his new role in the American Association of Aeronautical Engineers, 50,000 strong professional organization that represents people like the commercial pilots and all of the rest who are seeing these things as well. So it's not just the military, right? And they see it as a flight hazard risk because the pilots of the commercial planes are responsible for everybody's on that plane, and they're seeing these things and they're being distracted by them. These things seem to show up next to the planes sometimes. And it's like, well, they're not shooting at them, but they're showing up. And if you saw a big glowing ball of white light floating around your windscreen while you're traveling 600 miles an hour with a whole bunch of people, and that distracts you and something happens on the plane, then that might be a problem. So, okay, I think I've given a pretty decent, perhaps lengthy,
Yeah.
you know.
No, that was an excellent summary. I appreciate that. It gives you've touched on a lot of the questions that the students will have here. So I'm going to kind of prioritize some of our questions here. Apologies, students, if I skip yours. I think some of them have been hit on. But let's start with Cheyenne Mast. You can unmute yourself, and you guys are welcome to have your video on if you want. But Cheyenne, if you will unmute yourself and ask your question, we'll start there. So.
And no question is silly. I'll as necessary, I'll recontext the question for you.
No worries. Okay, Cheyenne, we got you here. I see you on here.
Okay, how do we know that UAP aren't simply space trash, atmospheric phenomena, radar malfunctions, or misidentifications?
Well, so your question in a way can be answered by the simultaneous collection of the information. So weather phenomenon, how do we determine what a weather phenomenon is? We use radar and satellites. So if it's a shiny thing that looks like a silver craft, and you're seeing it by eye, and then you're seeing it move at thousands of miles an hour, and people are seeing it by radar, LiDAR, visual, etc. Well, you can disprove any one of those if that was in isolation, but if you see them all at once and you have multiple witnesses, you know that it's not any of those things. So give me an example for that. Let's pick out one example at a time. That's usually the best way to answer the question. Go beyond your first question, if you want. Tell me what you think it might be, and let's talk.
I'm not sure. There's like a lot of stuff. I'm actually in an astronomy class, so I've gone through a lot of like space trash type of stuff, and like I know about all that kind of stuff. So I was just curious about how that.
Okay, so space trash. I don't even know. There was a guy who wrote an article at the New York Times and called it space trash. It was something interesting about that. I'll talk about those articles in a minute that came out recently. All right, well, it wasn't in space, first of all. It was, next to your plane, about 50 to 100 feet away. So it's not space trash. It's not that, because it's 50 feet away from your craft and you can see it, it's not a radar anomaly. And you've got visual on it, and then you have pictures of it. So it's not just somebody's testimony. But then you've got them moving, instantaneously 5,000 miles an hour. They move somewhere else. They see them on the horizon. They see them come back. And then more interestingly, perhaps, and these come from many of the sightings by the US Navy, they see them moving underwater by sonar at several hundred miles an hour underwater, which no submarine can do that. And then they leave the underwater and go into the air. And then that's where it's tracked by radar. And then they see them leave the atmosphere, and we have satellite images of them actually leaving the atmosphere and like heading out towards the moon. I don't know any space trash that can do that. So what I would be careful of, and this relates to some of these debunking articles that come out, is they'll say, oh, it's just people say. What people say? Who are these people who say? And by what criteria do they claim what they say? Are they scientists? No, usually. They're actually, in many cases with the news reporters, they're just quoting other news reporters. And believe me, I've dealt with plenty of news reporters over my years, and they have ways of twisting your words into pretzels. So here's something interesting that happened. So about a month and a half ago, the UAP report to Congress was supposed to come out. It's been delayed, not for nefarious reasons. It's just because governments tend to be inefficient. But in the couple of days before the reports were supposed to come out, there was a coordinated series of articles that came out in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and military.com, which has nothing to do with the military. They're just a commercial place that called themselves military.com. And they all had these, very snarky, snide, oh, it's space trash. It's, it's garbage. It's swamp gas. It's balloons, Mylar balloons, etc. I mean, all completely disprovable things, but what they were doing is they were trying to get ahead of the UAP report, which is going to come out this month, which I know some of what's in it, which is like, here are another, since the last UAP report last year, here's another 100+ events. And there were 500 events. We could characterize 400 of those 500, but the last 100, we don't know what the hell they are. It doesn't mean they're aliens. It just means that no matter what we did, we can't figure out what they were, and they were doing something really weird. Now, I think the part of your question that's the best is it some sort of natural phenomenon that we don't understand? I don't know, ball lightning, or they're not ball lightning, but something that is some sort of natural physics phenomenon that does something that we don't know what it is, and it looks shiny and it moves fast, and it has nothing to do with aliens or extraterrestrials or interdimensionals or what have you. That's a completely fair possibility. And in fact, we still leave open the possibility that that's what it might be. But it's one of those questions that no matter what the answer is, it's going to be interesting. I call them Zen questions, right? It's interesting no matter what. Might not be what you want, but it's interesting. Then there's what we often call in science the Las Vegas question. You're only interested in it, it's the one that gives you the big money return. If it's no, you waste a lot of time, right? So I see these as, well, if we understand something more about the world around us, about reality, and it just happens to be some natural phenomena we didn't understand before, then fine. And I've said this publicly many times, I'm more than willing to close up shop and go back to my day job if somebody shows me conclusively that it is some sort of natural phenomenon. But no one to date has, and they had 60 years to do it.
Good question, Cheyenne. And you're hitting a lot of the questions we got here, Dr. Nolan. Inadvertently, it's great. Let's skip to Amelia G. Dr. Nolan hinted at this before, but Amelia, let's see if we got you here to ask your question. Oh yeah, that's fine. So
don't be shy. I don't bite. I'm nice.
Oh yeah,
I was nice to Cheyenne, wasn't I?
Yeah, I think so. You got it, Amelia, or you want me to ask it for you? You got an issue? Okay, so this is Amelia's question. You hinted at this before, Dr. Nolan. So why are sightings not taken more seriously?
Well, I mean, that's kind of a social stigma. I mean, so what we do know, and this is the truth, we do know this, that the military and the intelligence communities set up what's called a disinformation campaign, PSYOPs, psychological operations, for, in the early days of the post-Roswell moments, where they didn't really know what it was, but there was evidence that it was not from here. And so they basically came out and they began to ridicule people. They started calling it swamp gas or space trash or whatever. And so there's something interesting about the human mind. The human mind is usually begging for an answer to a question, right? And all you sometimes need to do is give them any answer, and it's sufficient. I mean, so let's look at politics, for instance. A reporter asks a politician a question. The politician gives an answer that is wrong, but the politician insists that it's right, and then they walk away. And then the followers of the politician, this is not a left or a right issue, the followers of the politician all nod their head and go, yeah, it's that. It's, and so it's in science, you can't get away with that. If you answer with a ridiculous response, you will be shunned. You won't be asked to the next, conference. You won't get the grant, etc. That's not how human nature is. If you ask your parents, is there a Santa Claus? And they say, yes, there's a Santa Claus. That's the end of it, even if you know it's not. Or if you say, why should I mow the lawn? Because I said so. And most of these answers are kind of a because I said so answer. And but they went a step further, and that's part of what the new law seeks to address, is to say, if you lied and ruined people's lives, we want to know, and we will hold you responsible. So they're afraid of the lawsuits that are coming, to be quite honest. So for instance, why wouldn't somebody else that I tell that I'm involved in this believe me? Well, some of the first scientists that I told back around 2013, 14, they said, Garry, you're going to ruin your career. Well, my career was already well taken care of. I'd already made plenty of money, so I don't care. But my response to them was, well, wait a second. Isn't the rule of science, aren't there principles that you shouldn't be afraid to ask a question? And if you don't know the answer, aren't you the one breaking the rules by not asking the question and thinking that the question has already been answered, or telling me that I should be ashamed to ask the question? And so I use that kind of an approach every time and put my colleagues in their place with that and say, well, look, you're not being a scientist, you're being a priest, right? You're basically not following the rules that when you got your PhD, you signed on the dotted line here that says, it's okay to ask questions if you don't know what the answer is, but it's not okay to say that you shouldn't ask the question. So people are being shamed. And, so, think about it. Shame is a societal control device. When you were a child, the first thing that your parents, you probably remember your parents said, is you should be ashamed of yourself. You shouldn't do that. Well, if I know I'm right, and then why should I be ashamed? Right. So I don't let anybody shame me. If I know I'm right, I'm not saying I should do anything I want. I'm just saying, if I'm doing something that's right, I shouldn't be ashamed.
Spot on. Good answer. Let's see here. Cheyenne Adams, do we have you in here? I like Cheyenne's question. I don't think she's here. I'm going to ask it. So she wanted to know, what can we learn about UAP without having in-hand material? You have the rumored, actual physical materials, but not having that in hand. What can we still learn about them?
Well, if you see something moving at 5,000 miles an hour instantaneously and then stopping, and this is some physicist friends of mine have worked this out. Okay, well, if you move that fast and stop that fast, from a physics standpoint, that means you have control of momentum and inertia, right? So what kind of physics would let you travel in your car at 5,000 miles an hour and stop on a dime? Well, none that we know about conventionally. So then some physicists all got together and said, okay, well, what would you need to do with Einstein's equations to accommodate that observation? And then they looked at the equations and the variables and the parameters and said, well, you know, there's this parameter here that we had previously put a threshold on because we didn't think that kind of energy was available. So as you get into deeper kinds of math, you know, there are these things called singularities in math, or asymptotic levels. And they said, well, what happens if we went beyond that and we put in extraordinary amounts of energy, stuff that people 30, 40, 50, even 100 years ago thought were not possible? And suddenly you find that there are ways to do it. I mean, it requires basically turning the entire rest mass of the sun into energy every second, which, you know, that would basically blow up this arm of the galaxy if you did so in an uncontrolled manner. But with that, you can warp space and move in these ways. So in speaking to one of the physicists, I remember I was in an elevator with him, and I said, so wait a second, what you're saying there is, you say that they're doing this, but that sounds dangerous. I said, yeah. I said, so then you mean that they found a workaround, they found a trick? He said, yeah, we think they're cheating. We think that they found a trick that we don't understand yet. I mean, look at what we've done in less than 100 years. You know, we've gone from nothing to space flight. You know, we're barely out of the caves. When I was your age, just a little bit younger than you guys there, the computers were so primitive. Your watch has more compute power than anything I had available to me as a young boy. And I was really into computers. I was a nerd. You know, now we have things like quantum computers and other things that are coming. So where will we be 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 years from now? So, you know, the galaxy, the universe is what, 13 billion years old? There's no rule that says we're the only ones here. And there's no rule that says we were the first form of life. In fact, there's plenty of, you know, I wouldn't call it evidence, but reasons to believe that life could have started elsewhere and traveled here, even if it was just algae, right, or small bacteria. So, you know, what happens if another civilization started 1,000,000 years ago elsewhere, or even on this planet? What happens if there was a small group of dinosaurs that were smart enough? I mean, even just this week, there's what was that new hominid?
Homo naledi?
Yeah.
Yep.
It looked like it was here before us, 200,000 years before us. It was much smaller than us. It already had control of fire.
Yeah, I hadn't mentioned that to students yet. So you guys remember last week we talked about Homo naledi? There's an article that came out this week that showed it knowed how to use fire, the little hobbit hominid. So, and the architect, the archaeologist has implied that there's something else that he's going to be releasing through peer review, which is the right way to do it. He's getting it all peer reviewed, which I think means they had tools. I suspect that he's going to say that we found tools. So somebody else was around before us 200,000 years before. Who's to say that some of what we're seeing isn't them? They said, well, there's big, ugly Homo sapiens. Let's go underground. We don't need them anyway. We like it underground. Wow, no, that's a lot to think about. How you doing on time, Dr. Nolan? I don't want to be taking too much. I know you've got dinner.
I can take a couple more questions and then I will have to go.
Oh, absolutely. So we've got a few good ones here. Karina, raise your hand. Are you here? Man, where the hell did everybody go? Well, I like Karina's question. Okay, she was going to ask, what sort of equipment can we use to track UAPs, or what sort might be more useful than others?
Well, there's something called an atomic clock. It's a standard piece of equipment, and the atomic clock works by basically a radioactive material that has a certain breakdown time, and that breakdown time has a set parameter that you can use essentially as a clock. But if some of the ways that these objects move is by warping space-time, you can have two atomic clocks near each other or far away from each other that are very closely calibrated. Or let me do it like this, they're on, off, on, off, on, off, and they're calibrated no matter where they are doing that. And then if one of these objects moves by and it warps space-time, the atomic clocks will be off kilter, right? So that's one way that you do it. Others are by, we think we know some of the frequencies that their craft emit. I have a friend of mine who's one of the launch commanders of the satellites for the the NSA. And he said, you know, these things seem to show up whenever we're putting up some of our satellites. And when they do, we have an all band frequency sensor. And, you know, here's the frequency that they seem to emit. And when we see that frequency, if we look around, we see these objects moving around.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So, and I was, I've been talking to some other people who are, the military has some extraordinary sensor systems. I mean, stuff that, of course they won't talk about it because, you don't want your adversaries to know about it. I mean, I wish we didn't have adversaries, but it's the world we live in, unfortunately. So that's why part of this law is set up to recalibrate them. So here's what's fascinating. This is just fascinating. So data is collected, I mean, from all of this billions of dollars of sensor system. And so the first thing it does is, because there's so much information coming in, if it doesn't look like a plane, and if it doesn't look like a missile, they throw it out. Well, guess what doesn't look like a plane and doesn't look like a missile?
Right? Data.
So all that data is thrown away. And you can't blame them because they're sifting through enormous piles of data. And they're trying to make a split-second decision because that data has to be determined. It doesn't take long for a nuclear ICBM to get from one place to another, 10 minutes. You can't sit around and have coffee trying to make a decision. You've got to make the decisions fast before the East or the West Coast gets blown up by nuclear missiles. I mean, we don't live in those days quite so much as we used to, but the threat's always there. So what the congressional mandate is now is to say, well, the data you used to be throwing away, we want you to sift it off and save it. And now we're going to have other people paid to look through it, to look for these signatures of things doing stuff that they shouldn't. So the data is being collected, it just hasn't been looked at.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we'll give you one more question here. I like Haley's question here. She was wondering how we might be able to communicate with UAP, or if attempts have been made.
Oh yes, many attempts have been made. Yeah. and there, I can't talk about it, but there has been evidence of them replying.
That's a little titillating. Okay.
Yeah. No, it's really quite interesting. It's quite interesting. I mean, they don't like land and say, hey, here we are, blah, 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 but there's evidence of communication as well. I mean, just the very fact that they show up and let us see them is communication. I mean, we know that they can stealth themselves and not show up, and so here's another way to look at it is maybe, if you're a million-year-old civilization, you've already been around longer than we've been civilized. And maybe your timeline is a little different. And maybe you realize that you can't just show up and change everything. I mean, what has happened in human history when one more advanced civilization shows up over another? Now, advanced doesn't mean smarter. Advanced just means more technologically capable. So when the Europeans showed up in America, well, they destroyed all of the subcultures in the North and South America, just ran rampant over them, right? But even when the British showed up in China, I mean, they weren't able to overrun them, but they changed things in a way that was deleterious, at least for a short period of time, to the Chinese. They've made up ground since then, the Chinese, of course. So maybe they understand that, if you show up and you've got all these miracle opportunities and the receiving civilization is not able to deal with these concepts, then maybe you're just doing them a disservice. Maybe we're just not mature enough. I mean, I've used this example. I mean, frankly, we're a bunch of angry monkeys throwing poo against the wall or at each other all day long. I mean, do you want to deal with a bunch of kindergartners and telling them, no, you can't have the candy yet? I mean, maybe we need to kind of raise our maturity level before we're ready to deal with them, or they're ready to deal with us, I should say. Or the other level is maybe they just don't care. And like I said before, maybe the communication of them just showing up is enough to say, why don't you think about this a little bit? Here we are. You can make it past your adolescence or your childhood to this. It's going to take you another million years, but it's not our responsibility to grow you up. We'll just do what we can in minor ways to stop you from blowing each other up. And that's one of the reasons why it's a fascinating set of stories. You can go back and look at it, of back in the 60s and 70s. These things showed up around our ICBM Minuteman outposts in the Midwest and shut them all down. It's a fact, right? I mean, it's in the military documentation. They just shut them all down. And why do they know it happened? Because first of all, servicemen and officers came forward and said it happened. They saw them, and then everything just shut down for miles around. I mean, how did they do that? I mean, what physics do you have to do to be able to reach inside of these bunkers and just turn switches off? Because basically 3 months later, somebody tracked down the records of the service people, the contractors that were sent out to turn the missiles back on. In the Soviet Union at the time, the opposite happened. These things showed up and turned all their missiles on with a countdown, and then they couldn't turn them back off. So everybody was in a panic because all their missiles were about to shoot at the United States and start World War III. And then like 10 seconds before, they all shut off again. So what that's communication.
Yeah.
That's saying, look, this is what we can do if we ever wanted to. You can't do anything to us. We can stop you from blowing each other up, but maybe you need to learn a lesson. Maybe you need to go through an apocalypse and then realize the next time your civilization comes up that you shouldn't be doing this stuff.
Oh,
it's good. It's a great question. Don't get me wrong.
Oh yeah. No,
It's
that's fascinating. Yeah, I followed up on some of that stuff, but what I'm going to have to do, Dr. Nolan, here is I will let you go. I'm going to give my students here a test review.
okay.
We very much appreciate your time and your patience with us and in helping us out. Very much so.
Yeah, my pleasure. So here's what I'll tell you people to do. There's a movie that's probably the best one out there that I like. It's called The Ariel, Ariel, named after the archangel Ariel. The Ariel phenomena. And it's about these 60 or 70 school children in Zimbabwe, white and black children, who saw an object that came down near their playground. And you just listen to these children, they were like between ages of 6 and 12, and you determine whether what they saw was real and if the stories that they were telling were real. It's an absolutely amazing movie because they actually go to a couple of the people now 20, 30 years later and ask them to recount the memory of what happened. And many of them said it changed their lives.
That's a fascinating.
But they have the original footage
Yeah.
from the interviews of the children within about a month of the event happening.
I'll see if I can find that and share it with you guys too. So that's a fascinating story. So
Yeah.
cool.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nolan. You have a good night and we appreciate
You
it.
too. Okay. Bye-bye now.